with complications following hip surgery. We've been praying for Freeman Force, who has been at Rainbow Rehab in the Memphis area and hopes to go home in a few weeks. No visitors, but cards would be appreciated. Betty French moved from ICU to a subacute room, continues to improve slowly. So we thank God for that improvement. Continue to pray for her. Jerry and Aaron, Harris's aunt, Joyce, has shingles and asks for strength and comfort. And Sandra Galuli has been diagnosed with throat cancer, will undergo 7 weeks of radiation and chemo treatments beginning April 18th. I think Keith and Sandra are second service people, typically. So if you see her, be sure to give her a hug. Carolyn Holloway will begin chemo treatments this week for a small tumor. John Plezick at a rehab facility for physical therapy for about 3 weeks. And Arlene Favaza's father, Harley Levitt, is in the hospital, not expected to recover. So, prayerful for the Favazas. We've been praying for Elizabeth Newsom, Joanne Tishner's mother. Recently had a stroke and is now at home and is just doing PT and OT to recover from that stroke. I think the rest of these folks are those who are sort of consistently on the list. Cindy Ray, Zeke Rivers. We mentioned Ed Riddick last week, scheduled for a heart cath on March 29th. Today, right? Is it today?
Yeah.
So, I imagine it's already happened.
So we've got an update.
Okay.
Young blockage that came instead, did fine, about to go home in a few minutes. But his wrist started bleeding badly.
His wrist.
He's fine. I think it's just a blood thinner. But they're admitting him overnight.
This is where they would have put the IV on his wrist. Gotcha. Okay, we'll be praying for him. Okay. So Heather Campbell is asking for prayers for fourth grader. I think he was in Bartlett schools. Nathan Simpson was hit by a car last August, and he has surgery scheduled for April 6th to remove some wiring from his mouth due to that surgery. So Heather was just asking for continued prayers for Nathan. Sue Job's sister-in-law, Sally Smith, in the hospital with bowel blockage. And remember I guess it would have been second service this past Sunday, we announced Kevin Surratt placing membership, but he couldn't be here because he actually had to leave right after first service to go see his brother John, who sort of all we know is his health is failing due to cancer. So prayerful for Kevin and his family. And lastly, Mary Lou Shannon's brother Eddie Yarborough scheduled for surgery on his leg tomorrow. As far as announcements, we've got the Easter egg hunt this Saturday, April 1st, at Todd and Peggy Strickland's home. Hunt starts at 4:30 on the dot, and Susanna was telling me they have sort of different stages for the different age groups. So she was saying, like, for Kara's group, the 1-year-olds are just going to dump the eggs into a big pile and just let them like slowly pick them and throw them at each other. But they've got sort of different stages that are increasingly more difficult. Starting at 4:30, but they are asking that you bring side dishes, desserts, and lawn chairs if you want to sit. And rain boots, because it might be a little muddy. Yeah, it's supposed to pour on Friday, isn't it? Yeah. I imagine we still need some help with the eggs. Do you have an idea of that?
All the conversation I've heard lately was around the rain or not. So
okay.
We plan to potentially go to the back instead. Like he's got it. So if guessing we still do.
That's everything for that, and then just the prayer focus that Landon is having us focus on this week is for the fruit of the spirit of self-control. Any other requests or announcements we need to be aware of?
Pray for all those people in Nashville.
Yes. Yeah, if you didn't hear, there was a shooting at a school in Green Hills in Nashville. What was it? Tuesday, Monday? Monday. 3 kids killed, 3 adults. Yeah. Okay. David, can I ask you to open us in a prayer?
Heavenly Father God, I thank you for today. I thank you for everything that you do for us, God. I'm thankful for Jesus. I'm thankful for this church family. I'm thankful for Logan and for the preparation he's done for tonight. I pray that you be with him. Be with us as he opens the word to us. And I pray for all of those mentioned tonight. I pray especially for those in Nashville right now, and just for those who are hurting and for those loved ones who are hurting. I pray that you would help us to be a blessing to them when possible. Help us to just be your hands and feet as we go out. And I pray that you just help us to be more and more like Jesus every day. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay, so I think we have a few folks who are new to this course, so let me just sort of orient us. This is called the Story of the Bible, and we call it Part 1. We've got a sequel to this class that does the New Testament. We're just focusing on the Old Testament. And essentially what we're doing is just walking through the major themes and stories of the Old Testament, trying to connect them all. We've used this analogy of like, if you're like me, reading through the Old Testament is like turning a box of puzzle pieces upside down, and you've got all these pieces, you don't quite know how they fit together. Like you've got David and Goliath and Noah and the Ark, and what we're trying to do is interconnect those, so it's along a narrative arc, and we can understand the story that points to Jesus more clearly. So that's what we're going to be continuing along with this evening. I did want to point out, last week we talked about the Exodus and the 10 plagues, and a lot of what we did was say, yeah, there are themes in Exodus that actually connect back to Genesis chapter 1, that actually connect to the exile in the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah. And that's essentially, if you were intrigued by that, that's essentially what this book is, called Echoes of Exodus, tracing themes of redemption through Scripture. Is Alistair's thesis is that the Exodus is a foundational story in the entire Bible, and that even how Jesus is portrayed is riffing off of the Exodus. And so he sort of just develops those themes throughout Scripture. Really fascinating book that you might be interested in. Echoes of Exodus. But we're going to continue along today. Now, when we say the story of the Bible, we don't mean that the Bible is some concocted fairy tale. We mean something more specific, and we've defined it like this. The grand story from Genesis 2, and if you've been in here, how would you fill that in? Yeah, Genesis 2, Revelation, aka the entire Bible, about God redeeming his people, and even grander than that, all of his creation. Yeah. So this is what we mean by the story of the Bible. Sort of the main goals that I hope every class helps us with, so that you know you can open up to, here's 1 Kings chapter 19. Here's Elijah on the top of the mountain with the prophets of Baal. I know how this connects to the larger story of what God began in Genesis chapter 12 with the blessing of Abraham. And you can become more fluent in that narrative, how it connects to Jesus. And then our big sort of application is to say, And it's not just a head knowledge thing. When you understand how the arc of the story, you realize it cuts right through your life. And God is asking you to step into the story as well. And the more fluent you are in that story, the better you can live it out. Okay, help me fill this in as well. This is to look back over what we've covered so far. So, for example, in this bottom left, we call it Act 1, Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Hey, come on in. God makes a very good world. He blesses it. Humans are his images. What would you title this part of the story?
Creation.
Yep, creation, followed by then Act 2. I said in the young adult class, Genesis chapters 3 through 11 is creation just falling down the stairs. It's just one disaster after another that you might call what? Beginning with Eve taking the fruit from the tree. The fall, right? Followed by God wanting to fix this. He calls a man, Abraham, beginning in chapter 12. And then the rest of Genesis is just Abraham's lineage, trying to live out the promise. We've called the rescue plan. Last week we covered Act 4. The title is sort of given away in the book we looked at called The Exodus. And today we're going to cover Act 5. God tests his people, gives them a way of life to experience blessing. What does that remind you of God testing his people after the Exodus?
Wilderness?
Yeah, the wilderness. So here are the different acts if you want to break up the story of the Bible that way. And hopefully this becomes more and more fluent and you can sort of pick up wherever you open up in Scripture. So let's go ahead and remember where we came from. Last week, hey, come on in, welcome.
Hello.
Last week we ended with Israel being delivered from the Egyptians, and they just crossed what famous sea? Not blue, but Red Sea, right? Yep. And we said this is a story of recreation. What do we mean by Israel passing through the waters being a story of recreation? Help explain that to me.
The story of creation starts with the Spirit hovering over the face of the deep.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And in the same way, I think I have this. Yes. They cross the Red Sea, and in Exodus chapter 15, they break into the first song of worship ever recorded. We think it's the oldest text in the entire Bible, the Song of Moses. And they are just absolutely partying because they were just delivered from the Egyptians. And creation language is used here. Genesis 1 language is used in Exodus 15. They're singing to God, you blew with your... And if you have it open, does your translation have a different word here?
It says wind.
With your wind?
But it's ruach.
With your breath, your translation might say, but all of these are from the same Hebrew word that can also be translated with your spirit. And now, as good story of the Bible readers, we're thinking back to Genesis 1, verse 2. And the sea covered them. So this is a moment of redemption, of recreation, where I think of it as God hitting the reset button yet again, just as he did with Noah and the flood, covering the face of the earth with waters, just like Genesis 1:1. Reset to the beginning. What's God's purpose in continuing to hit the reset? What is he trying to get at for his creation?
Reconciliation?
Yeah, reconciliation. The word that Genesis 1 verses 28 and 29 uses is blessing. Blessing. This is, if I had to summarize what God wants his creation to experience, I think the biblical term for that is blessing. It means the ability to be fruitful, multiply, and flourish, fill the earth, be image bearers of God. We come out of this high moment, recreation. It's going to happen. We've got hopes. They're singing and dancing, and then they're led into the wilderness. And if you're like me, you picture the wilderness like this. And I recently had a conversation with some friends. I asked them, this is a table talk at Logan's house. How do you picture the wilderness? And some of them said like a dense forest, like a jungle.
Or just the woods.
Or the woods.
I can claim that. That's me.
But other people agreed with you.
Me and my mom both pictured
Yeah.
the woods. Because of
I've not thought of it like that.
I don't know.
But yeah.
Now are the chiefs of...
Sorry.
Were you
Exodus
going
going strong. Yeah, and I think it's more like this because it represents a barrenness, a state of God has not dug his hands into that ground to bring life. It's a sort of pre-created, chaotic state in the wilderness. And we're going to find the wilderness represents this space where there is not life, there is not the presence of God. So you can see how sort of facepalm hopeless this is in the story of God. Now, let me ask you this. Why does God leads them into the wilderness? God keeps them there for 40 years. This is not the blessing he promised. Why does he do this?
Part of it is their punishment. But clearly they weren't ready to go into the promised land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Displayed by what moment where they showed they weren't ready?
Well, I mean, they continually had acts of faithlessness.
Yes, please do.
They had recurring acts of faithlessness.
Yeah.
So their faith in their God just wasn't there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, acts of faithlessness. And turn with me to Numbers chapter 14 to understand the rationale behind the wilderness, because otherwise it does seem a little mean-spirited. Numbers chapter 14, could somebody read verses 1 through 4?
What was that again, Numbers?
14, 1 through 4.
Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt."
Now they're saying this after chapter 13 when the 12 spies go to check out the promised land. And they come back with, do you remember this? They cut a stack of grapes that is so large they have to throw it over a pole over their shoulders between two men. But they also see that they see that the land is covered with these giants, what the Bible calls Nephilim, and that the fight will be difficult in their eyes to gain the promised land. The people respond with fear, lack of trust in God. Okay. Now look at God's response. Could somebody read verses 30 through 34?
30 through 34.
Mm-hmm.
Not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb, the son of, I'm sorry, I'm running from Jeff, okay.
Something like that.
Joshua, the son of Nun. But your little ones, who you said would become a prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure.
Okay, so they are to spend 40 years in the wilderness, and it's very specifically matching the 40 days that they spent spying out the land. So here's the rationale behind it. It is a punishment of sorts for their lack of trust in God. Specifically, did you notice this? For their lack to fulfill the original commandment to be fruitful and multiply, they're saying, we want to go back to the land of captivity and slavery, where our children were killed, instead of stepping into this land flowing with milk and honey, where we will surely be fruitful and multiply. I think we're supposed to see this as them refusing to carry out the original command. And it all but makes sense that then they experience the barrenness of the wilderness as a result. In this way, the wilderness represents disobedience and being withheld from Abraham's promise. Now, it's helpful to know this about the wilderness because the theme of wilderness comes up all the time in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the Bible wants you to understand that when the wilderness is brought up, you're to think chaos, barrenness, lack of blessing and promise, a space without God. It's not a good place. So that, this is all over in the book of Isaiah, for example. Like in Isaiah 64, the writer is lamenting that because of Israel's disobedience, Zion has become like a wilderness, a desert, a wasteland. What is this? How does this impact the way that you read about Christ's time in the wilderness in Matthew 4 and Luke 4? If it represents a space of disobedience and lack of blessing up until Jesus, what does he start to shift about it?
I think it is like it as if he's like no one has passed the test up to this point.
Yeah.
But here he is.
Exactly.
That's where Satan attacks him. That's where the attacks happen in the
Mhm.
wilderness. But Jesus is able to use this.
Yes. We're not surprised as story of the Bible readers that the most intense temptation, the most intense opportunity for disobedience for Jesus happens in the wilderness. It's a place of disobedience and rebellion. And yet what Jesus does that nobody else has been able to do is he is the faithful Israel in the wilderness. And out of the wilderness, he conquers rebellion. And then he steps into the promised land and unleashes blessing. Right? Man. So that's just one you understand this theme, and now the mission of Christ becomes so much more impactful. I want to apply this a little bit to our own faith, because sometimes we'll say this about a stage that we're in as Christians today. Like, I feel like I'm just in the wilderness right now. And you know what people mean by that. It's a time of scarcity, might feel far from God, have a hard time connecting with God or hearing from Him. It's a time of testing. If you've got somebody who says that to you, I feel like I'm in the wilderness. What's a good response for them? What should they do?
I guess the way I think about it, the wilderness, if you look at it as a consequence of Israelites' actions, in that sense, it's always pointing it back to God,
Mm-hmm.
right, and their dependence on Him. I think about that in terms of life. Even Jesus, in His example, He's always pointing back to God and being with God,
Yeah.
even in the wilderness. In my walk, as I think about my times in the wilderness and just people I associate with, that's the opportunity to really see God. You know, in the good times, you know, it's easy to, you know, forget that we have a Creator, but when it's rough, right? That's when it's easier to, or should be easier to see, certainly your need for God.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think, pointing back to God is the way I would think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. How else would you put that? How should we navigate the wilderness?
The psalmist talks about the wilderness all the time, and
Yeah.
it's like he's there more often than not.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of times his solution is just to wait.
Yeah.
And he maintains hope, even when there's no evidence of hope, and it's just
Yes.
a waiting game. And
Yes.
if you look at the stories of the wilderness, it's all time limited. Like, nobody lives in the wilderness. It's a passing phase, and so
Mhm.
the psalmist just says, "Hope in the Lord, wait on the Lord."
Mm. Yes.
It's also a time of transformation. Like John the Baptist was out there for the renewal. Like, you go out to come back
Mm-hmm.
sometimes.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not an
Yeah.
easy place, but
Sure.
it's you know, he's out there baptizing. He's trying to get them to
Yeah.
start over again.
Yes.
Likewise, Christ doesn't start his ministry until he goes out of the wilderness. So
Right.
it is important.
Yes. Time of transformation.
And a Christian cannot avoid it. To be merged into who God really wants all of us to be, we're all going to go through a wilderness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We should be telling people that on the front end. It's not much of a sales pitch, though.
Like a butterfly, you come out better. If you allow God
Yeah.
to do what He's supposed to do in the wilderness, people that depend on God come out the best image of God in the
Yeah.
wilderness.
Hmm.
I guess I would echo what they're all kind of saying, and hopefully, sorry, we're kind of squishy today.
Hey, get one more on
Get
the
real
couch.
tight over
The
here.
boys' couch.
I guess I would just say, help remind them that to wait, be expectant of like hope and
Yeah.
like a new journey with God. Or, you know, one of my friends a long time ago told me, you know, you don't like what you're experiencing now when I was going through a hard time, but you're gonna thank God for it later.
Mhm.
And so I guess maybe just helping them remember, like you said with the psalmist, maintain your hope and expect to be able to see what God did in you or for you through that hard time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
Do you think this should be something people face alone?
Mm. I can tell you have an answer for that question.
Uh-huh.
I think that's important though. Being willing to share with others. I'm in a place where I feel like I'm in a wilderness. And then watch as you experience God's presence through other people. Yeah. And I said earlier, the wilderness is a space without God, but in some ways that's a misnomer, because the grace of the wilderness, even in Exodus and Numbers, is that God figures out a way to show up. He figures out a way to bless. And in a barren wasteland, God is having streams of water flowing out of dry, cracked rocks. And God is having birds as far as the eye can see fall from the sky. And this bread-like substance grow from the ground. To our surprise, as we see the waste, the wilderness, as a sort of pre-created chaotic place, we find that God actually is so good and faithful that He will provide and He will show up even there. And one of the main commands that God gives to His people during this time in the wilderness is listen to my voice. And I just found that so challenging as I was kind of preparing for this. Because oftentimes I'm like Israel, and when God's presence thunders from the mountain and they're told to draw close, they tremble with fear, and they ask Moses to mediate. They don't want to hear the voice of God. They don't want to draw into God's presence in the wilderness. And as Christians, can't that be the same for us sometimes? Because of a fear that we're not worthy, we're not good enough, or, fill in the blank. And yet, to y'all's point, it's in the wilderness that sometimes we hear the voice of God most clearly and experience His presence most fully. Last thing I'll add, God actually explicitly gives a reasoning for why He leads them in the wilderness. And they know they're going to go through it in Exodus 15. Part of the song is, how do they put it? Something about traveling, passing through, that's the word, passing through. And eventually they'll get to Canaan. Eventually they'll be drawn to the mountain, that is Zion, Jerusalem, where they will experience God's presence. But that's after passing through a time of trial. So they know it's coming, and it's because God tells Moses earlier, I forget exactly where this is. Y'all remember this? He says, I don't want to take you, Israel, along the western coast, because the big bad who are there? The Philistines. They're the coast people. And they're the bad boys who will destroy you. And so I'm purposely leading you through the wilderness so that you can survive, even though it's going to be a time of testing. So actually, the wilderness is an act of protection. And I think that's true about the wilderness today in some ways. That God in His providence and His goodness may be walking with you through a time of trial and testing. And you realize on the other end, it was for your own protection from something greater. So we then go from the wilderness as they wander through. Here's the promised land in the northeast. And because of their faithlessness, they're told to wander for another 40 years. And along the way, they experience God's presence on a mountain. Do you remember this one? Mount Sinai. Moses receives the Ten Commandments. It is, when I heard this Bible fun fact, this blew my mind, and it's not just because I'm a Bible nerd. The event that receives more chapters than any other event in the entire Bible, not the resurrection of Jesus Christ, not the creation of the universe. More chapters are spent on Israel at the base of Mount Sinai than any other moment in the entire Bible. It's basically the entire back half of the book of Exodus, the entire book of Numbers, and parts of Deuteronomy. Or I think it's entire Deuteronomy, parts of Numbers. And the narrative really slows down. All of that happens in just 1 year, whereas there are single verses in the Bible that cover thousands of years. Like, so there's an importance to this even outside of the book of Exodus. This is foundational for how we understand who God is. What happens at Sinai is they experience the presence of God. Those are the wrong verses. Those are from last week. It's going to start in Exodus chapter 19. And on top of Mount Sinai, Moses receives the law, which then governs how Israel navigates the wilderness and the promised land. So there are a few things that I wanted to highlight as we think about Sinai and the law. There's a way to think about what God is getting after since the beginning, is that it's to dwell in the presence of his people. Do you remember in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve, they hear the sound of God walking in the garden? And this was apparently just how he did. He just walked with Adam and Eve in the garden. His presence was that intimate. And they're cast out of this, and the whole Bible laments this distance. And so God then constructs a system through the tabernacle, and there's a certain space where they can enter as uncovered as possible into God's presence. Do you know what that specific room is called in the tabernacle? Or the temple? Holy of Holies. I was going to say, hint, it's really holy. The Holy of Holies. And essentially this is the garden packaged into a single space so they can step back into it. So it's no surprise that guarding the entrance of the Holy of Holies are two cherubim, these angelic figures that remind us of the two angels standing outside of the Garden of Eden as Adam and Eve were cast out. And it's as if to say, you're drawing back into the garden when you step into the Holy of Holies. Now, what we see on Mount Sinai is the tabernacle is sort of imposed onto the mountain. So that this outermost court of the tabernacle or temple is where the people of Israel reside at the base of the mountain. And then, do you remember who goes up about halfway, but they don't draw fully into God's presence at the top? What group of people? Aaron is their homeboy. Yeah, the Levites, the priests, right? So they step sort of halfway into God's presence, reflecting this inner court of the temple or the tabernacle where the priest can dwell. And then lastly, Moses, the high priest, the mediator for God's people. He is able to experience God's presence. He's got to hide behind a rock sometimes, That is, the Holy of Holies is represented at the top of the mountain. You see how its tabernacle is imposed onto the mountain. And what God is doing at Mount Sinai is he's setting up a way for the people to draw into his presence. This purpose, this goal that he's had from the beginning. Remember, we're connecting this to Jesus. Then it's no surprise that in John chapter 1, what does John say about Jesus? That he took on flesh, and the word is literally, he tabernacled. He became a walking tabernacle among us. John reminds us of Exodus 34, a Mount Sinai scene, when John says that Jesus is full of grace and what? Grace and truth, right? Yeah. The exact phrase that God uses to describe himself in Exodus 34. A God of grace and truth. So, what is John's point? If Jesus is the walking tabernacle, if Jesus is the theophany of Yahweh put on flesh, what's his point?
Way to restore the intimacy lost in the garden.
Yes, yeah, it's the blessing, it's the garden coming back, and Jesus Christ is the one who is ushering it into everyone's hearts by his Spirit and his victory over the old man, which separates us from the holiest of holies. Jesus is the walking, unshielded presence of the Creator God. He is the restoration of everything that was meant to be.
It even shows the emphasis why that was torn.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. And the way that we experience the presence of God is because if you're a Christian and you've been baptized, you are filled with the Spirit of Jesus. And there's nowhere you can go that the Spirit is not already there with you, including the wilderness. So here's another wilderness lesson that we learn is even when it seems God is distant and you can't connect with him, that because of Jesus, his Spirit is always with you and you are never alone. That no longer is there a veil, no longer is there a mountain to climb, no longer is there a mediator, a high priest, a man, Moses. It is you directly connected to the Spirit of God. I think that's good news. Now, David's going to have to help me with this one. Moses then comes down from the mountain. Did you know that Moses, in the narrative, walks up and down the mountain 7 times in the book of Exodus? Dude's got his... He has completed his rings every day. He's got some steps. And after spiking them with frustration the first time, Moses delivers the law to God's people. Which then, if you're doing like a read the Bible in 1 year, you come to Exodus chapter 20 and you start to regret your life's decisions. Because then it is a slog of the rest of Exodus and a few fun stories and numbers. But basically the rest of Pentateuch is just law. I believe that even the law, even these strange, antiquated laws about, what am I supposed to do if my ox charges my neighbor's slave and the ox's horn goes through him? What am I supposed to do? The Old Testament has an answer for that. And yeah, I think it's connected to this larger theme of blessing, restoration, and it has a lot of significance for us as Christians. Before I give my take on it, I want to hear from you, and David's sort of the local expert because he's teaching an entire course around this. What significance, if any, do you find as you read those laws as a Christian?
Was that a question to me, or was that to the class?
To the class.
Okay, good.
And then maybe we'll
All right.
have you wrap it up.
Can you repeat the question?
What significance, if any, does a law have to you as a Christian?
You like specifying the 10 Commandments or like anything else in the
Or even
Boiling a goat in
the
its mother's
637 other ones, yeah. Yeah.
To me, it's about, I see that God took special care, time, and effort to set the people apart from the rest of the world.
Mm.
They had, we look at it as a bunch of rules and regulations, and I'm sure they did this. But if you take a step back and look at the world that they lived in, it gave them a distinction that was utterly unique. And gave them the ability to be something that the rest of the world was not. And so I see it as something that was special in the sense that it set them apart.
Yeah. Yeah. That's helpful. A sort of putting teeth to the promise God gives in Exodus 19 that his people will be a holy people and a royal priesthood.
And pointing them back to what human was supposed to be, or was intended to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's very hard to hide that you're a Jew. If you're comparing it to us. You
Sure.
know?
Right.
The world knew a Jewish person by the way they lived their life, by the things they celebrated, but every decision they made, from the diet, everything they did, because God made sure that they would be noticed. And people would think, why are you doing this? So they could point back to our God.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I think we blend too much.
Me too.
Even today,
Yes.
you can tell when somebody's a Jew.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Easier than you can tell if somebody's a Christian sometimes.
Yes.
I think there's a pushback to be held to a certain standard. Friend's grandpa was Jewish, and every time we would see him, I was like, man, I don't know if I could do this. Like, and then we spent some time in Israel, and it was even more like we showed up on the Rosh Hashanah, it's the Jewish New Year, I forget which holiday it is, and the streets were completely empty. And I mean, would I be that hardcore to where I literally wouldn't leave my house for 2 days? Probably not, I don't know.
Right.
And I think sometimes it makes me question if those things were considered necessary for salvation. Like, I don't know, would I really be willing to go that far?
Mm-hmm.
I think human nature, we just do better when we have that straight and narrow. We know, exactly where you're supposed to be. Even if it's hard and we question it, we still feel more secure with those boundaries.
Yeah.
This sounds a little wonky, but to me, there's a little bit of comfort that like God cares so much about the intimate details of like my ox and my neighbor's slave, like that. Yeah, like that He cares about the tiny little things in my like mundane day-to-day life.
Yes.
And I think that makes it beautiful too. Like our holiness and sanctification happens in like the mundane, day-to-day, tiny little things too. Whether we're following 3 books worth of laws or not, but like he cares about the tiniest details.
Yes. Ooh. And that the tiniest details are part of what it means to follow God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, okay, let me give my best shot at this, and then you can clean up my mess. I was struck by all of these laws, however specific and strange they are. They're giving Israelites guides for how to rule, have dominion over every inch of creation. Here's what you do with the beasts of the field. Here's what you do with the birds of the sky. There are a lot of really weird laws about reproduction. I'll put it like that. Here's some guidance from God about how to be fruitful and multiply. And I realized that God is actually giving his people some guidance and some wisdom for how to carry out this commission from the beginning. To be fruitful, multiply, have dominion over every square inch of creation. So that these laws aren't random, but they apply to the specific areas that we've been tasked to have merciful dominion over. It's the law is a way to participate in the blessing of God. What else would you add to that?
Yeah, what you said right there, dominion, like, the thing that comes to mind for me is going back to creation. Like, we're made in the image of God. And what does that mean? That means that we have a responsibility. God, like, they were all made in the image of God, and they were then to work the garden and to have dominion over it. So what you said right there, and I mean, if you look at, I remember hearing this when I was growing up. It's like, man, the law was all just a bunch of rules, but it's like, just look at the 10 Commandments here. Like, worship God, and it's like law, but then like, look at the last few. Like, don't covet. That's a heart thing. That is not a outward thing. That is a heart thing. There's heart in there.
Yeah.
And when Jesus sums it up with, it's about loving God and loving neighbor. Well, that comes from the law.
Yeah, that's Leviticus 19.
And I mean, the law is about like, you should have a fence around your roof. It's like, that's so that someone doesn't fall off and die. So it's not that you have to, it's about, or the, don't defraud your neighbor of their money, like, because you were slaves in Egypt. So it's about, the way that I might describe it is, it's how they were to be the image of God in their context.
Okay.
In the new, in the promised land. That's why there's some odd things, like boil the goat in its mother's milk. That doesn't mean anything to us, but it meant something to them, so it's like, you need to look different. You need to love your neighbor, and this is the ways that you can love your neighbor. And that's, I mean, the Jubilee laws, like all of the, Jesus pulls all of that stuff in.
Yes.
So, there's a historian, not the actor Tom Holland, but the historian Tom Holland. And he has this thing where he said, he was studying the Roman world and the Greek world. And, you know, he grew up thinking like, our Western society is based on like Greek and Roman rule. And then he was like reading about some of these people and he's like, that doesn't sound like what I value. And what he realized was all of the things that he values about Western society don't come from Rome. They come from Jesus and Paul. And then it's like, well, where did that is from, you know, their interpretations of the law.
Right.
So
it's setting this moral framework that Jesus does not abolish, but actually magnifies and fulfills.
Yeah.
And it's fundamentally, it might seem like a bunch of cold hard laws, but it's fundamentally and explicitly Luke chapter 19, or Leviticus chapter 19, and Deuteronomy 5, explicitly about loving other people. Yeah. And then Jesus comes along in Matthew chapter 5, and he says, what I'm about to tell you and show you is a fulfillment of these things. It's what it looks like to live these in your context to their fullness. And they're dramatic ways of self-sacrifice and service. Christ then is a trailblazer for the good and beautiful life, and for a life that is oriented wholly toward the other. So what we've done is we've looked at this next chapter, this next act in the Old Testament. After deliverance from the Exodus, you have the wilderness, the experience on Mount Sinai, and the receiving of the law. And hopefully you can place these a little better into the grander story and see how they connect to themes of blessing, pardon, God's presence, and ultimately to Jesus. Any last comments or thoughts?
I was thinking about the wilderness. That wilderness, we think a dusty place, very sad time, but it can be a very successful time in your life as well. Like wilderness can look like a very successful career and being so depressed, or having a great family, a great wife, great kids, and being depressed and without purpose.
Yeah.
So I think it's good to
That's a good
talking
point.
with other men. I realize how common is depression. I think at my age and above after
Sure.
30s, being depressed and having everything, and, money-wise,
Right.
having everything and being depressed.
The wilderness can be sort of sneaky, subtle in that way. Yeah.
And all of that is lack of God. So.
Yes, absolutely. All right, that's all I got. Appreciate y'all.